All right, you guys. So we're coming into the Fed meeting tomorrow, and Powell's going to come out and talk about his ideas for the future with rate hikes. And the core concept for tomorrow is if there is a change in policy, right? And so one of the things that would be bullish for the market would be if he comes out and he talks about giving guidance. So what you would watch for is him saying, we're going to do 0.50 rate hike in December. It's expected to do 0.75 tomorrow. And in the past, what he's been doing is saying then the month moving forward will be data dependent. If he stays with the idea that the rate hike in December will be data dependent, that's a bearish result. If he gives guidance and says we're going to do 0.5, that's a change in his philosophy, and that would be bullish. And so this guy here is Alan Greenspan, and he has this quote that everybody kind of knows, and it just says, how do we know when irrational exuberance has unduly escalated asset values? And so the question now is, how long and how to time when this irrational exuberance is recognized, and then Fed Powell comes in and says, we're not going to have it. Okay, and so as you know, the Fed has to bring down these asset prices. They have to cause the market to sell off, and they have to create some deflation to balance out the inflation. Real simple. And so what I want you to pay attention to for tomorrow is just that simple thing is like, if it is bullish, if he gives that guidance, then he hasn't come to the conclusion about the irrational exuberance, right? So today you had JP Morgan come out and say that they think he's going to do that to give the guidance forward. JP Morgan's stock rose like 3 points off of that. So what I've noticed watching this stuff pretty closely is that I started to feel and sense over the past couple of weeks that there's a disconnect between the market. They call it dislocated. The market is dislocated from what average people are seeing. So that's one thing to take a note, but that happens, and it's not something to trade off of. It just, if you trade like that, you're going to get wrecked. You have to understand that the power of manipulation and all these things, that dislocation is something that a lot of times people don't understand. How can the market continue up when things are dire? Why would anybody be buying any stock right now knowing what's to come with a recession that's been confirmed by every economist in the world? Why would you possibly buy? That's what an average person can't understand, right? They certainly can't understand something that might take place tomorrow. So I just want to show you and kind of go off this idea of irrational exuberance, right? And so last week, the SPY on Wednesday was trading here. And if you remember, Amazon came out and Meta came out, and Amazon sold off. This is the move from last week. Amazon sold off 15%. At one time, it was down 20 in that one move. Yeah, 24%, 23.40% in that move off of the poor earnings. That's last week. This is last week's candle. Okay. Meta, which is Facebook, same thing. Came down 29.82%. So Amazon and Facebook sold off 25 to 30% last week. Okay, remember that. That's on Wednesday. Okay. Now, what is irrational exuberance, right? So Facebook sells off, Meta sells off, kind of Thursday things find a direction, but by Friday the market had rallied. I think it was like 2 or so percent. Yeah, 1.91%. So the market rallied. Think about irrational exuberance, irrational. Amazon sells off by nearly a quarter, of its value, and Facebook sells off a third of its value, and the market rallies. That's irrational. Okay. And so coming in tomorrow's meeting, what I can see developing is, and it's hard for average people to understand, but it's like this idea that, and what I've seen actually is a culture. That's what I'm starting to pick up on right now in the past like 3 weeks of this is, I'm just a dude that grows some lettuce. I pay attention to this stuff closely. I've been doing it for a while. So I'm not in that culture. I'm not even, I'm in a hoodie. I'm not a trader like I'm not after the money, right? Not in the same way. And what I started to think about was that over the past decade, that there's a lot of young people and a lot in this culture that has developed. If we go back, say some of these cats entered even in 2000, right? They've been through some shit. Let's say that, they were a financial advisor, etc. They've been through some shit. But if you were looking at the market, let's say you entered the market a decade ago, okay? So there's a culture. So a decade ago, when people came into the market and they started to work these jobs and all that, there's a culture built into this. That's what I'm starting to pick up on. There's an idea, an underlying cognitive bias. And, people, there's movies about, how savage Wall Street is. But what I started to see is that a lot of these guys and these funds, they've traded this range for a decade. They only know this. And so it's hard because I'm just a dude growing some lettuce and, hanging out in my house. And like to see what is happening with big money. This is big money at play, and how the big money has become disconnected. How does that happen? They're just people. They have biases and they have things that they want. And they've only traded this environment. So that's something really that started to set in this week. Even going back here to 2010, it's something to think about. There's a culture that's developed during this time, and I think what we're seeing is a pivot in the culture, right? And these even the big dogs, Jamie Dimon, these big dogs, they've become accustomed to certain things happening in their favor. Too big to fail. And my guess is that it's kind of like kind of needing to give somebody a smackdown a little bit. Fed Powell is probably the most powerful man in the world in a sense. Who makes these decisions? Ultimately, I don't know, but he's the spokesperson. And what he says carries such weight that it moves all of the money in the entire world on a word. And I think he might flex that power. That's what I'm thinking for tomorrow's meeting, is that you might see Chairman Powell come out and flex that power, because he does not want to see the market continue upwards. And when you have Jamie Dimon coming out and saying ahead of time what he thinks Fed Powell is going to do, it's not a good look, right? And he's kind of like, Fed Powell's been pretty dovish and kind of like, he's kind of a wuss, right? And so this idea that Powell can come out and more or less, why is that doing that? In a word, just shut the market down, is really something I've been thinking about today. And so going into tomorrow's meeting, my idea is that what you're going to see is a very hawkish Powell. And he's going to, none of this is all speculation, but I just have to show you where this is coming from in my thought process. And a lot of people would disagree with this in a way, but they're all in that old conditioning. And I'm really good at understanding my own conditioning, pretty deep life. And so when I look at this, I go, Fed Powell does not want the market on this horrible earnings, this irrational response. He doesn't want to see this. He has got to find a way to bring this down, right? So this culture, it's not even manipulation. They don't even know any better, right? It's like my puppy doesn't know any better. It's never been outside the fence. And some of these guys, they might be 30 years old. They might be 40 years old. And they've really only traded an environment where the Fed is very friendly. They've never seen the Fed come out and really get after it. So the other thing to think about is there's this international pressure on Powell to ease, because as the dollar accelerates, it crushes all these other economies. I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think he's going to buckle to that pressure. It doesn't feel right. Last time he cited Jackson Hole and what happened there, and I think he's going to use that as a talking point and kind of go back to this idea that he's going to stick with the plan that was made at Jackson Hole, which is basically data dependent, right? So on the macro, what you're seeing in this SPY last week is irrational exuberance. There's no other way to explain it. And it's just a matter of how long or when does the Fed come out and squash that? Because these guys like Jamie Dimon, they think they got they do have a lot of power, but they don't have nearly the power that Powell has and the Fed does, right? So I'm going to show you some other basics and things to look at, because you're going to have CPI, right? It comes out next week, and that will be the next big move. It's like a constant, you're in the most volatile market of all time, right? And so I want you to see this. This is your gas futures, okay? And if you know anything about trading, this is a downwards wedge, right? And you see how it's stuck on this trend line, and then you broke higher, came back down, this kind of movement. Notice how you're holding support here, okay? And so, like I had said before, on the last inflation, people are still guessing. I'm going, it's going to be high because gas stayed the same and or was up on the prior report. And now, today, we still have the same thing happening. Okay, so now your oil futures are continuing to the upside. So if we were trading this, we might wait for a pullback, and then you're going to wait for a consolidation and then maybe a move out. But the way this is looking is that this pattern is going to break higher, right? And so what that looks like, if you're not aware of it, is like these patterns, then you'll create another wedge, right? And that wedge could go up to there, it could go to this green line, but you'll see this new pattern start to form, an uptrend, right? So you're going to see an uptrend in these oil prices, and it's not like altcoins. It doesn't mean that it can't come back down, but it doesn't seem probable, just looking at this pattern and knowing what's going on in the world, that somehow it starts to form this further downtrend. You see how that pattern would play out? You would come down and form this downtrend, and if we were trading it, you see how this price action would stay within this downward channel. Then if you were trading this, this would be a bull trap on oil. So that would be something to pay attention to, because this price of fuel is going to have a lot of influence over the next CPI. I want to show you this other stuff. So as you look through, these are all kind of like commodities. I have them all grouped right here. I don't think that these will have as much effect on next CPI, but I noticed some big moves in what you're seeing here with commodities is that you had this through July, they kind of tapered off, but now you're starting to see this support being built, okay? You see this macro pattern here? You see how support is getting built on corn futures? And if you go back, you see how flat it is? Just kind of, look how flat it is. This goes back to 2018. Look how flat it is, right? And then you start to see this rip. Now, if we were trading this, what I'm looking for, if we were trading this like an altcoin, what this actually looks like to me is, right, you see the down, up, sideways. Now it can continue sideways for a long time and set up a support here. That's very possible. But it can also break higher. That would be also very possible. And I'm not saying over the next couple of weeks. I'm saying as a trend over the next 6 months to a year. And so what you're seeing for this month is in this month, in this end of October, which will affect December. Follow the logic, right? What I'm showing you now is that we have this upwards trend coming into the end of October, early November, or today's November 1st or 2nd. You see, and we're starting to see a trend upwards. And what is that going to do? That's going to influence the inflation for next CPI, which would be coming out in December, and that would be data dependent rate hike. Okay, so Fed Powell comes out, he says it's going to be data dependent, and we have our first candle here showing us, and I want to show you because across the board, look at these commodities. Oil up, wheat up, that's on the news from Russia, corn up, soybeans, the most boring shit in the world. Soybeans up on the daily. Look at that on the daily. So you're seeing, as soon as November kicked in, you're seeing the price of the futures contracts, soybeans, so boring, 2.27% move in a day. And that's not saying it's just going to rip like it did back in when the war kicked off, but something to pay attention to is that on the first day of this month, suddenly we're seeing a rise in commodities, which is not what Powell wants to see. The commodities need to come down. The assets need to come down. Everything needs to come down. Okay? So that's what I'm paying attention to for tomorrow. When you look at this, which is the 10-year Treasury, here is so this is at 4, okay? And I started talking about it. I said if it broke 3.5, shit was going to hit the fan. And look at the breakout on that. You see how quickly it moves? It moved very violently and quickly up to here, came down, and what should worry, not worry, but what you should be aware of is you see how it held support, 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 and bounce. So if we were trading this, what are you looking at here? You could see a little tick down, it's a 10-year treasury. It's not supposed to move crazy. But eventually, if you get a break to this upside, you're looking at a topping pattern, which would actually eventually call for a recession, but it's a leading indicator. So what you're seeing is that this didn't create on the 10-year treasury shoulder, head, right? It's starting to do this. It could be a wonky shoulder. That could happen. It's possible, right? But you also could be seeing this, which would be 3 drives to a high. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you're seeing these bullish patterns on things like that. And I'm not saying to trade patterns on TNX or something. I'm just pointing out the obvious. On TLT, irrational exuberance. Okay, so here we are. The market is, and I've talked about 104 as a shit hit the fan moment. This 97 that takes you all the way back to prices in 2014. And so now with this irrational exuberance, this will show you a lot. The market needs to cooperate a little bit. If you see the bonds are not playing along with this rally, right? If you see the bonds start to pull back, this is one to watch for tomorrow. And it doesn't have to move a lot. That's what you have to understand. Look at it like an iceberg. Okay, this doesn't have to move drastically to create a move. It's a very big, it's the largest player in the game. This is the biggest player on the board, right? This is the all-star quarterback. What it says is eventually going to happen. Like in a football game, you got the little dudes running around over here. They think they're playing la la la, and this is a monster that all it has to do, he's so strong, all he has to do is put an arm out, and he can knock down 3 or 4 guys. That's what we're looking at with this. So if you see just a slight pullback, especially at the levels it's at, that's bearish, and the bonds will respond tomorrow, and so watch for the pullback on that. So these are the things to pay attention to for tomorrow, and you can see there's another one. Now, look at this irregularity. So everything's crashing to hell. Everything's gone to hell, and the Dow Jones is putting in a monster rally. The Dow Jones has diverged from the NASDAQ and from the SPY. Okay, not normal. Here you have the currencies pulling back. You see this candle here? This is a shooting star. You can get a bounce off of that. This came into, you see this support? You see it came into support, and now it's continuing to the upside. This could also signal a reversal. We'll have to wait and see. But if you see a break to the upside on this, no bueno. Right? And then the pound, look at what happened with that. Came right into resistance and sold back off. And that is, I'm not saying to trade currencies off support and resistance. That's not what I'm saying. I'm trying to point out some very obvious stuff here. That you're forming this pattern, and unless things change, you're not going to see further upside. You've topped. Okay? You see? Topped. These perhaps have topped, and when we had this, we had big problems. All right, so the pound, those were not, the irrational part of it is in Monday, September 26, you nearly had the collapse of the U.S. or the British pound. The entire currency almost collapsed in this month. right? And so I think that Powell's going to bring it home tomorrow. I think that there's a real potential that he's kind of in a rock and a hard place, and the market's not listening, right? It's irrational. It needs to be a little bit of a smackdown, you know. Somebody's got to step in the room and say, "You guys, this is over." Right? We're not gonna, and every time there's a pivot rumor, it's like Bitcoin bulls back in control. Meanwhile, world currencies are collapsing. China's continuing lockdowns. You have midterms coming up. All these things, man. So stuff to pay attention to, and to try to follow the news tomorrow would be really good. Even if you're not going to trade off it, I wouldn't recommend it because it can be so volatile, that it's like you get wrecked either direction. So if you're not in trades, I wouldn't open up trades based on tomorrow. Anyway, guys, hope it helps.